So let's take a look at Ruth Benedict's Anthropology and the Abnormal. Just read the very first sentence of the essay. She says, modern social anthropology has become more and more a study of the varieties and common elements of cultural environment and the consequences of these in human behavior. So the first question you may have is, why are we reading this in a philosophy class? I think that's a good question. She says modern social anthropology. That's what she is. She's an anthropologist. Some other interesting things in that opening sentence, a study of the varieties and common elements of cultural environment, suggesting that when we compare cultures, cultural environments, that there are varieties, there are differences, and there are possibly samenesses too, common elements. And that she's interested in the consequences of these samenesses and differences on human behavior. And so already we kind of get an idea of the orientation of Benedict's thinking. That is, in that notion of the effects of cultural environment on human behavior. That's what she's interested in. She's interested in how customs, mores, social or cultural environment in general actually impacts on human behavior. Sort of assuming that we are, to a large extent, and this is really the question, if not completely molded by our cultural environment. And what's interesting about this essay is to think about to what extent and how far we accept that claim that we're molded by our environment. She starts out, reminding us that we modern, so-called modern people, have our own cultural environment, and that one of the things that is good to do is to look at so-called simpler cultures, and she's thinking of cultures of people who live in pre-industrial cultures, people who live in the traditional ways, the small farmer or hunter-gatherer, really, way of life that was common to human beings for such a long time. To study those still existing, vanishing, really, cultures, to see that our own beliefs, our own behaviors, and our own categories, especially of what is normal versus what is abnormal, are not universally accepted. He says on page 1, in the higher cultures, the standardization of custom and belief over a couple of continents has given a false sense of the inevitability of the particular forms that have gained currency. And we need to turn to a wider survey in order to check the conclusions we hastily base on this near universality of familiar customs. Now, first of all, the so-called higher cultures, maybe that's not so politically correct these days to use an adjective like higher, implying that there are lower cultures. But she really means modern industrial civilization and the standardization over a couple of continents at that time, at least. I believe this was written in the 1930s. That meant Europe and North America, with some other outposts that's obviously different in our day, almost a century later, 80 years or so later. But what is she saying there? That we if you grow up in a culture, you have certain categories of what is normal, what is acceptable, what is rational, etc., and what is over the line, what is abnormal, what is insane, what is beyond the pale. It would be a mistake to think that these categories that we use to order and describe our behaviors are the only ones. She says again on page 1, she refers to the one which out of our experience we identify with human nature. I think maybe that's one of her big messages here, is that human nature does not dictate one sort of culture with one set of acceptable behaviors. That we should see our own culture, as she says, as one entry in a long series of possible adjustments by looking at different cultures throughout the globe, we get to see what those other adjustments are. And that there's nothing inherently superior or inherently rational or even inherently natural about our own cultural beliefs. Now, this essay is called Anthropology and the Abnormal. So the main categorical opposition that Benedict is working with here is normality versus abnormality. And she just says it outright on page 3 that normality is culturally defined. And just sort of blanket statement, maybe the most basic commitment, basic assumption of her outlook here in this essay is the notion that there is no such thing as normality amongst human beings per se, that normality is always culturally defined. And she gives us, in the course of this essay, many examples of that, which we'll look at to some extent. After all, she's an anthropologist, and what she says is theoretically about morality, which ultimately we're interested in normality and things like that, ultimately has to be grounded in some empirical research, some actual different cultures and examples. So it's important to look at those. We will, I hope. But she gives us examples, and we're not in a position really to check these unless we're anthropology majors. Maybe you can help. Of examples of behaviors that, at least in her time, were regarded as abnormal or as if not insane, studies of trance, catalepsy, and homosexuality. Of course, this is 1930s, an American writing in the 30s, views towards homosexuality, of course, very different back, and are much more tolerant and much more acceptable to identify yourself as homosexual or gay. We use the term homosexual much more. But her point is that there have always been cultures in which people who we would call gay, men and women, have held very respectable positions, being openly gay. And she refers to ancient Greece, which is, kind of complicated, more complicated than she lets on, but it's certainly an example of that. Examples of all sorts of behaviors that we would regard as abnormal or pathological, as you look through it yourself, and are perfectly normal within those cultures, for instance, that seem to us to be based on paranoia. She mentions a culture where people never eat anything that they don't prepare themselves and watch their cooking pots very carefully because they are paranoid about being poisoned. So the constant fear of being poisoned in that culture would not be regarded as crazy, whereas I've actually met a few people who, in our culture, who were obsessed with that, and that was definitely something I would regard as a disorder. Maybe we can talk about that in class. Now, to our eyes or to our ears, maybe some of the things she's saying are fairly obvious and commonplace. And maybe they even were in the 1930s, I don't know. But as time moves on, we become more used to variabilities in cultures, cultural differences in all sorts of customs and traditions. And the notion that normality is culturally defined is really not all that shocking to us. That is, that maybe it's obvious that different cultures will inevitably regard different behaviors as being normal. But what about morality? So that's what we'll talk about in the next